Learning to read Chinese is an achievement in itself, but how fast you can do it also matters, regardless of your level. So how do you increase reading speed in Chinese? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to discuss reading speed, and like I mentioned in the introduction, this discussion is relevant for anyone learning Chinese regardless of your level. So it's not the case that you first learn to read, and then when you reach some advanced level in the future, then you try to read faster. No, reading speed is relevant on all levels, and in this episode, we're going to discuss how to improve it. Before we get to that though, I have two announcements to make, and one is that my pronunciation course is open again, and it will remain open until the end of Monday, November 27th. And you can check out all about the pronunciation course at pronunciation.hackingchinese.com, but it is a complete course that covers everything about pronunciation, so it's useful for beginners who want to get a good grasp of the sounds and tones of Mandarin, and also for more advanced learners if you want to go back and make sure you actually know these things, or even if you are a more advanced student and you want to polish your accent and sound more natural. All these cases are covered by the course, and you can learn more about it by checking the link in the description. The second announcement is that we have a discount for my courses this week, and this includes the just mentioned pronunciation course, but it also includes my other courses, one which is Unlocking Chinese, which is for beginners, and then one which is called A Practical Guide to Learning Mandarin, which is for everybody else. So there is a $10 discount for these courses, and it lasts as long as the pronunciation course is open, i.e. until the end of November 27th. Should you be listening to this episode later than that, you can still head over to hackingchinese.com/courses, and you'll be able to find information about the courses that I offer. And if any course is closed when you check it out, you will be able to sign up for a waiting list. Okay, with the announcements out of the way, let's get back to reading speed. This is a topic I've been thinking about and reading about quite a lot, and I've also changed my opinion over the years, both of what works best and also of the importance of reading speed. I will link to some of the articles I've written about this already in the episode description, but I want this episode to be independent from those articles and kind of be a new take on this topic. Normally, my podcast episodes follow the articles they are based on quite closely, but this will then be an exception from this rule. Reading speed is a complex topic, and it's something I think most of us have encountered in our native language before we started thinking about it in Chinese, if it's indeed something you have thought of. Learning to read in our first language and read quickly in our first language is very different from learning to read in Chinese, however, and it's very different from learning to read quickly in Chinese. So, in this episode, I want to make it very clear that what I'm talking about is, as I mentioned before, relevant for beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners. It's not very relevant for native speakers, but because, like I said, this is a separate discussion. So all the techniques you might have heard about speed reading or increasing reading speed in your native language, you can basically throw out the window. They are not very important here. When we talk about reading speed in this context, we mean reading Chinese, of course, and that is quite different from reading, say, Spanish or English or Swedish. But then we're also talking about reading Chinese as a second language, which is again quite different. I did talk about this in episode 67, or in an article called 6 Challenges Students Face When Learning to Read Chinese and How to Overcome Them. For example, one obvious way in which reading in Chinese is difficult is that you don't only need to recognize words, you also need to be able to separate the words out from each other in a sentence. Because of course, written Chinese doesn't use spaces between words like we do in, say, English, and so figuring this out is quite difficult and requires a lot of practice. But like I said, check out episode 67 if you want more of that. In this episode, we will then continue talking about reading speed. I think we can all agree that reading speed is important on all levels, if we take it to mean the speed at which you can parse and then decipher Chinese characters. So for example, if you're a beginner, if you read your textbook and it takes you, say, a second to read each character, so you finish your 100-character dialogue in 100 seconds. That is actually quite good. It means you're familiar with the text and you don't need to look things up and so on, and that's great. However, if you're an intermediate learner, this is quite slow if you're reading things you're already familiar with. But then again, if you're reading something harder, maybe a graded reader that isn't something you have covered before, so it's new content for you, then reading at 1 second per character is still quite good. Then, when you take an advanced proficiency exam, you will realize that you need several times this reading speed for unfamiliar text. And the jump here from the beginner to the advanced learner is of course very big, and so what I want to talk about is how can we improve our reading speed. And this is relevant beyond exams, of course. If you're a beginner, it matters if it takes you 1 second or 2 seconds per character, because if you're reading a text and it takes you twice as long, you will read less. It will be less convenient if you actually need to read this message for some reason, and so being able to read something quickly is useful beyond exams, and it can indeed be argued that if you read too slowly, it's doubtful if you can say that you can read Chinese. Let's say it would take you an hour to read everything on a menu in Chinese. This is not practically useful if you actually want to order food because, well, nobody wants to wait around for an hour while you read through the menu. So some reading speed is necessary to make your reading ability useful in practice. So how can you learn to read faster in Chinese? Well, I already said that you can throw away all the speed reading techniques you might have seen in your native language. Because in Chinese, for most learners, what matters is vocabulary knowledge. And when I say knowledge here, I don't mean just how many words you know or how many flashcards you have in your flashcard app or something like that. I also mean how quickly you are able to recover this information when it's embedded in context. And this is not exactly the same as recalling it when you see it on a flashcard, although that can certainly help. It gives you kind of a basis you can then use to improve your reading ability. So let's look at each of these a little bit closer, because the main thing that kills reading speed for almost all students is when you encounter words you don't know. This takes a lot of time. You need to maybe try to deduce the meaning based on what words surround it and so on. And this is difficult, and sometimes you will succeed and sometimes you will fail, but it will always be very slow. If we compare this to reading something where you do know all the words, sure, you might need to stop a little bit, think about what this character means and so on, and maybe it's used in a slightly different way that puts you off, but at least you have the ability and the knowledge to parse the sentence and understand what it means. But if there are too many unknown words or characters in a text, this will kill reading speed for sure. So one of the most important things is to build a broad vocabulary, and you don't necessarily need to know all the nuances of every single word, but having a basic knowledge to be able to read the words, such as knowing the characters, is very important. Naturally, there is more to reading than vocabulary, but like I said, I don't want to discuss the cognitive processes involved in reading here. That is not the point. I want to discuss those that matter most for reading speed specifically, and not knowing characters or words is definitely the biggest problem for a vast majority of students. So the second thing you need is to be able to recover or retrieve these words and characters from memory quickly enough to be able to read something at a desired speed. This is perhaps even more obvious when listening, because then the speaker sets a pace and you need to parse the language at that pace, and if you're unable to do so, you need to ask for repetition or you need to play it again if it's audio, but there is a fixed pace, and if you can't deal with the incoming audio at that pace, you will fail to understand. Now, reading is slightly easier because you can vary the speed at which you read. You can spend more time on something difficult and less time on something more familiar. But, of course, if the average time you need to recall something goes up, then your reading speed goes down. So I'm saying that knowing the words you already do know and knowing them well is also very important for reading speed. And being really good at the words you do know also will help you deal with the words you don't know. And if you know something really well and there's just one small thing you didn't know, maybe you can skip it and still get the gist of the sentence, no problem. Okay, so far we have identified two aspects that are important, and they are both related to vocabulary. And one of them is having a broad vocabulary, knowing many words and characters, and the other is to be able to retrieve the knowledge about these words quickly. The trick to improve reading speed and get better at both these two things, and also lots of other things, is simply to read more. And when I say read more here, I don't mean that you should spend more time in your textbook or trying to decipher difficult news articles or something like that. I mean extensive reading. And that is when you're reading when most of the vocabulary is known to you, you can get the gist without using a dictionary, and ideally you understand, well, almost everything you're reading. So this means graded readers for beginners and intermediate learners, and even for advanced learners sometimes, or at least stay away from those difficult topics where you need to spend lots of your time with a dictionary in order to understand what it says. And so what matters here, and as I discussed in an earlier Q&A episode, is quantity. And this means not how much time you spend, but how much text you are able to cover in that time. If we relate this back to what I said about knowing many words and knowing them quickly, reading then is the best way to practice this. Because if you read 10 different sentences where this word occurs, you need to practice retrieving it, and each time you do that, it will be faster. But not only that, you also practice parsing Chinese text, figuring out where words start and end, identifying the words, and using the grammatical knowledge you have to make sense of what you're reading, and so on. The problem is that most students want to push their reading ability. They want to read something which is at the limit of what they can understand. And if you always do this, you will not read enough text. And I was one of these students myself when I learned on many levels, and so I know exactly what this is like. But looking back, I realized I should have read much more and easier texts, not always tried for the hardest ones I could manage. If you are in a course of some kind, your teacher is likely to give you some reading in a textbook and then maybe some extra reading, and this is very, very far from what you need if you want to build any kind of reading speed, regardless of your level. You need to read a lot, and in order to do that, you need easier texts. So go grab a graded reader, or while you're at it, grab all the graded readers you can find because you're going to need them. Don't just read one on one level and then try to force your way into the next level. Read everything you can find on a certain level until you really think you know everything and it's getting too easy for you and you get bored maybe because of this. Then you can move up. If you're a more advanced student, and I'm including intermediate learners here, don't feel that just because you can, you need to read something difficult. And don't feel it's useless to read something easier just because it doesn't contain so many new words. How useful a text is to you as reading practice is basically unrelated to how many new words it contains. It is not a vocabulary mine, it is a way for you to practice what you already know and then occasionally sprinkle in something you don't. But the goal is not to always learn new words. The goal is to get better at what you already know. This just happens to be the definition of fluency development in Paul Nation's 4 strands model, and this is something we discussed in episode 99. So to conclude this episode, if you want to increase your reading speed in Chinese, you should read more, and remember then that reading difficult texts, spending hours with your textbook, probably doesn't count here. You need to read extensively. That is something we also covered in episode 16 if you want to know more about extensive reading specifically. But if you want one takeaway from this episode, it is to increase the amount of Chinese you cover when you read. Read more, and you will also read faster. You will also learn other things, so indeed, the more you read, the better. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.